Have you ever wondered what it was like to operate the most feared weapon of World War II? A machine gun so powerful that its sound alone could freeze battle-hardened soldiers in their tracks. But here's what most people don't realize. The men behind this weapon didn't want to be there. They knew that the moment they pulled that trigger, they became the #1 target on the entire battlefield. And the statistics prove it. Their survival odds were worse than fighter pilots, worse than flamethrower operators, worse than almost any other role in the German army. We're going to tell you why being an MG-42 gunner was essentially a death sentence, and how the very weapon that gave Germany its tactical edge became a curse for the men forced to operate it. So let's start with what made this weapon so terrifying. In the winter of 1942, German engineers accomplished something that seemed impossible. They created a machine gun that could fire up to 1,500 rounds per minute. That's 25 bullets every single second. To put that in perspective, the American Browning machine gun fired about 500 rounds per minute. The British Bren gun, around 500 as well. The MG-42 was firing 3 times faster than anything the Allies had. But speed wasn't the only innovation. The Germans had designed it to be cheap and fast to produce, using stamped metal parts instead of expensive machining. They reduced production time from 150 hours for the older MG-34 down to just 75 hours. This meant they could pump out thousands of these weapons while keeping costs low, and they did. Between 1942 and 1945, over 400,000 MG-42s rolled off German assembly lines. The sound it made was unlike anything soldiers had heard before. While other machine guns produced distinct bursts, rat-tat-tat-tat, the MG-42 created a continuous tearing sound, like ripping canvas or a chainsaw cutting through wood. American soldiers who heard it for the first time said the sound alone could freeze your blood. They called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. The British called it Hitler's Zipper. Even the Germans had a nickname for it, the Bone Saw. And that name wasn't chosen lightly. When this weapon opened up on a group of advancing soldiers, it didn't just wound them. It cut them down like wheat before a scythe. The 7.92mm rounds it fired were powerful enough to penetrate cover, and the rate of fire was so high that it created what German engineers called a steel curtain. Tests showed that a single MG-42 could saturate an area 50 meters wide and 500 meters deep with effective fire. Anyone moving in that zone was essentially condemned. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. The same characteristics that made the MG-42 so deadly also made it a beacon for enemy fire. Every time a gunner pulled that trigger, he was announcing his exact position to everyone on the battlefield. The muzzle flash was visible for kilometers. The smoke from burning gunpowder created dense columns that hung in the air for minutes. The vibrations from firing made nearby objects shake, windows, fence posts, even vegetation. And that distinctive sound, it was unmistakable. You could hear an MG-42 from 3 kilometers away under the right conditions. Allied soldiers were trained to recognize it instantly. The moment they heard that buzz, they knew exactly what they were facing and exactly where it was coming from. The Allies didn't just fear the MG-42, they studied it. They developed entire tactical systems specifically designed to hunt down and eliminate MG-42 positions. At Fort Benning in the United States, the Army created a 2-week specialized course just for neutralizing enemy machine guns. Between 1943 and 1944, over 12,000 American soldiers completed this training. They were designated MG Suppression specialists, and their entire job was to locate and destroy German machine gun nests. They learned to use sound triangulation, timing the intervals between bursts to pinpoint locations within 10 meters. They studied the visual signatures, the specific flash patterns, the smoke characteristics, even how the gun's vibrations affected the surrounding environment. Snipers received detailed diagrams showing the most likely exposure points of MG-42 operators. They learned to time their shots for the moment when the gunner would be changing barrels, those critical 8 to 15 seconds when he had to expose himself to swap out the overheated tube. And it wasn't just snipers. Artillery teams developed special ammunition with proximity fuses designed to explode above machine gun positions. Mortar crews had specific fire tables for targeting MG-42 nests. Fighter pilots were trained to identify positions by their muzzle flashes and attack them with rockets. The British developed tactics using 3-man teams. An observer, a sniper, and a Payat anti-tank weapon operator, all coordinated to take out a single machine gun position. The Soviets took a more direct approach. Their doctrine called for massive suppressive fire followed by frontal assault with grenades and explosives. It was costly in lives, but it worked. By 1944, the average time to neutralize an identified MG-42 position had dropped from 45 minutes down to just 12 minutes. The Allies had turned MG-42 hunting into a science. Now imagine you're a young German soldier, maybe 19 or 20 years old, and you've just been assigned as an MG-42 gunner. You've gone through 12 to 16 weeks of intensive training. You've learned to calculate distances instinctively, to fire in controlled bursts, to change barrels in under 10 seconds, even while under fire. You're part of a three-man team. There's you, the gunner, your assistant, who feeds ammunition and helps with barrel changes, and an ammunition carrier who hauls the heavy boxes of belted rounds. The three of you are the backbone of your entire squad. The other 7 men, the rifleman and the squad leader, they all exist to support you and protect you, because you're carrying the weapon that gives your unit its killing power. But you also know something else. You know that the moment combat starts, you become the priority target for every enemy soldier who can see you. The German squad was organized entirely around the MG-42. While American and British squads were built around riflemen with the machine gun as support, the German philosophy was the opposite. The machine gun was the primary weapon. Everything else was secondary. This meant that in any engagement, the MG-42 had to keep firing. It didn't matter if you were taking incoming fire. It didn't matter if you saw your assistant gunner get hit. Your job was to maintain that rate of fire, to keep the enemy pinned down, to give your squad a chance to maneuver or retreat. German tactical doctrine even had a term for it: Aufopferungsfeuer, sacrifice fire. The machine gun would maintain continuous fire over assigned sectors independently of the intensity of received fire. The manual stated it clearly. Operator survival is secondary to continuation of effective fire. Let that sink in for a moment. The German army had literally written into their tactical manuals that your survival didn't matter as much as keeping the gun firing, and they designed their defensive positions to reinforce this. Machine gun bunkers on the Atlantic Wall, those concrete fortifications overlooking the beaches of Normandy, they were built with excellent fields of fire. But the exits, they were often positioned so that leaving the bunker would expose you to enemy fire. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. The bunkers were designed to keep you in position firing until you were either relieved or killed. Some positions had only one entrance that became completely exposed once the position was detected. Architectural plans that survived the war show that German engineers knew about these vulnerabilities. They accepted them as necessary to ensure the gunners would stay at their posts. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the world saw what MG-42s could do when positioned correctly. At Omaha Beach, there were 15 German strongpoints, each equipped with multiple machine guns covering overlapping fields of fire. One of those gunners was a 20-year-old named Heinrich Severloh. He was positioned at strongpoint WN62 overlooking the beach. When the first landing craft came into range that morning, Severloh opened fire. Over the next 9 hours, he would fire approximately 12,000 rounds. His assistant gunner was killed early in the battle, so he worked the gun alone, loading belts, changing barrels, firing, reloading over and over. He later described it as feeling impossible. No matter how many he shot, more kept coming. The beach was packed with American soldiers, and his machine gun cut through them like a scythe through grass. By early afternoon, his position was collapsing. His ammunition was gone. His comrades were dead. He grabbed a rifle and ran, scrambling through shell craters and hedgerows until nightfall. The next morning, surrounded by American troops, he surrendered. But he was careful, very careful. He never revealed that he had been one of the machine gunners responsible for so many deaths on that beach, and that caution probably saved his life, because captured MG-42 gunners faced a terrible reality. The Geneva Convention said prisoners of war should be treated humanely. But on the battlefield, in the heat of combat, after watching your friends get cut down by machine gun fire, those rules didn't always apply. There are documented accounts of MG-42 gunners being shot on the spot after surrendering. Allied soldiers, enraged by the casualties they'd just suffered, sometimes executed captured gunners before officers could intervene. It wasn't official policy. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. and the German gunners knew it. They knew that if they were captured, especially right after a fierce engagement, their chances of survival were uncertain at best. This added another layer of psychological pressure. You weren't just afraid of being killed in combat. You were afraid of what would happen if you survived and surrendered. The medical records tell a grim story. German field hospitals kept detailed casualty statistics, and the numbers for MG-42 operators were devastating. In the 342nd Infantry Division during the Normandy campaign, MG-42 operators had a 41% mortality rate in their first 30 days of combat. Compare that to 13% for regular infantry and 8% for mortar crews. But it gets worse. 60% of operators died during their first prolonged engagement, any combat lasting more than 2 hours. Of the survivors, 75% didn't make it through their second week of active combat. The few who survived longer than a month often developed what doctors called machine gun neurosis, extreme hypervigilance, inability to sleep, violent reactions to sudden sounds. Some had complete mental breakdowns. Forensic evidence from excavated battlefields confirms the targeting. A French-German project that began in 2004 excavated 47 confirmed MG-42 positions in Normandy. In 43 of those positions, they found the remains of the primary gunner still at his weapon, hands on the controls, body oriented toward the field of fire. No evidence of attempted retreat. One position, WN-73 at Omaha Beach, contained the remains of a gunner named Hinrich Severloh, not the same Severloh who survived, with 14 bullet impacts from different calibers. This indicated that multiple Allied soldiers had fired at him simultaneously. His right hand was still closed around the trigger. His left hand held a partially loaded ammunition belt. He had died exactly where he was supposed to be, behind his gun, firing until the end. The wound patterns were telling. Regular infantry soldiers received random wounds from suppressive fire, hits to arms, legs, scattered across the body. But MG-42 operators showed a different pattern. 78% had wounds to the head and chest, the areas most exposed while operating the weapon. 23% showed multiple wounds from different calibers, suggesting coordinated attacks. And the causes of death were different too. Regular soldiers died mostly from artillery and fragmentation, about 67%, but MG-42 operators died predominantly from direct small arms fire, 54%, and directed explosive attacks, 31%. This wasn't random. This was deliberate, targeted killing. The Allies had made MG-42 crews their priority, and the statistics prove they succeeded. There's another aspect that's rarely discussed: the psychological toll of operating the weapon itself. Imagine firing 12,000 rounds in a single day like Severloh did. Each burst cuts down multiple men. You watch them fall. You watch them try to crawl to cover. You watch medics run out to help them, and you cut down the medics too, because that's your job. You're not shooting at distant targets. You're shooting at human beings close enough that you can see their faces, see them react, see them die. And you do this for hours. Some gunners broke under the weight of it. There are documented cases of operators who simply stopped firing even though the enemy was still advancing. They sat frozen, staring at the carnage they'd created, unable to continue. Others became almost mechanical, disconnected from what they were doing, firing without emotion, without thought, just following the training until something stopped them. The German military tried to address the mortality problem. They implemented rotation systems requiring operators to be replaced every 72 hours of continuous combat. But chronic shortages of trained personnel made this impossible to maintain. Records show that less than 30% of German units kept to these schedules during prolonged campaigns. They developed techniques for using multiple positions, having each gun team prepare 3 to 5 alternate firing points and moving frequently to avoid being located. But this required time and resources that weren't always available. They tried improved camouflage, better communication systems, indirect fire techniques using telescopic sights. Nothing fundamentally changed the equation. The MG-42 was too effective, too distinctive, too central to German tactics to ever be anything other than a magnet for enemy fire. By 1945, the German army was facing a replacement crisis. Between January and December of 1944 alone, they lost 31,000 MG-42 operators in combat. Their training schools graduated only 23,000 replacements. That's an 8,000-person shortfall. To fill the gap, they sent inadequately trained soldiers to the front, men with less than 4 weeks of specialized training. Of these poorly prepared replacements, 76% died during their first week of active combat. The 12th SS Panzer Division's records illustrate this perfectly. In the first 6 months of 1944, they lost 127 operators. The replacements included 34 soldiers with minimal training. Within 1 week, 26 of those 34 were dead. The machine was consuming its operators faster than they could be replaced. And yet, despite all of this, despite the astronomical casualty rates, despite the psychological trauma, despite knowing that taking that position behind the gun was likely a death sentence, men still did it. Some because they believed in the cause, some because they had no choice, some because their training and conditioning had prepared them to accept their own death as the price of duty. German instructors at training schools used techniques that would later be recognized as psychological conditioning, repeatedly emphasizing that personal survival was less important than mission completion. Operators who showed excessive concern for their own safety were eliminated from the program. The effective MG-42 operator, one training report stated, must psychologically accept his own death as a precondition for weapon functioning. The few operators who survived the war carried those experiences with them forever. Many never spoke about what they'd done. The memories were too heavy, too dark. Others, like Heinrich Severloh, eventually broke their silence decades later. Severloh spent years haunted by Omaha Beach. In the 1960s, he began reaching out to families of fallen American soldiers, trying to make some kind of peace with what he'd done. In 2000, he met David Silva, an American veteran he had wounded on D-Day. The two men sat together and talked. It was a meeting neither could have imagined in 1944. For Severloh, it was a small measure of peace, but the weight never fully left him. The legacy of the MG-42 extends far beyond World War II. The weapon was so well designed that it's still in service today, modified and rechambered as the MG3, used by militaries around the world. It influenced the development of nearly every modern machine gun, including the American M60. But the human cost of that effectiveness is often forgotten. Thousands of young men, most barely out of their teens, sat behind that weapon and pulled the trigger knowing that they were signing their own death warrants. They were told it was for the fatherland, for victory, for honor. But in the end, they were sacrificed on the altar of tactical efficiency, consumed by a military doctrine that valued firepower over the lives of the men who provided it. The MG-42 wasn't just a weapon. It was a death trap disguised as a technological marvel. It gave Germany a significant tactical advantage, yes, but it did so by systematically destroying the men who operated it. Every burst of fire that tore through enemy ranks also painted a target on the gunner's back. Every position held, every attack repelled, every beach defended came at the cost of the young men behind the guns. They were the most important soldiers in their squads and the most expendable. They were given the most powerful weapon on the battlefield and the shortest life expectancy. That's the dark truth behind Hitler's Buzzsaw. It didn't just cut down the enemy. It devoured its own operators, one 3-man crew at a time in a war that consumed everything it touched.